Once upon a time, the hack and slash genre was thriving with some absolutely incredible games. Devil May Cry 3, God of War, Kingdom Hearts if you wanted to go the more RPG route of the genre. Castlevania even got 2 hack and slash games. Which, speaking of, Konami, please greenlight a third game. Hell, even the Nicolas Cage Ghost Rider movies received a tie-in hack and slash game. Nightmare Before Christmas 2. Why? Who knows? This is just how action games were back then. There are probably many more that I have missed from the PS2 and PS3 era, Dante's Inferno being one. All of these games overlap in their design in one way or another. If you look through these games in order of their release, you will see how they take mechanics from games before it and tweak and improve. But as time went on, this style of action game fizzled out, just stopped being a thing. Now, of course, me saying this style of action game doesn't exist anymore would be wrong. But at the same time, can you blame less informed people? In the last decade, what has released? DMC5, Assault Spy, Bayonetta is now Nintendo exclusive, so it's now a lot less accessible, and that's kind of it. I know people are going to mention this in the comments, but no, I don't really consider God of War 2018 and Ragnarok to be in the same category as the games I mentioned earlier. I consider these games to be a mix of Souls-like and hack and slash with a pretty heavy lean towards Souls-like. But this is getting off track. If you disagree with me, argue in the comments. Hack and slash has been seeing a bit of a resurgence recently. Ninja Gaiden 4 released recently, despite the DLC controversy. There's Tides of Annihilation, which is looking very fun and fluid. So, in this last 10 or 15 odd years, what happened to this genre? Simply put, Dark Souls happened. Now, I have nothing against Dark Souls or From Software's games in general, but with Dark Souls' popularity skyrocketing over the years, developers or publishers, I don't really know who to blame here, have decided to focus on the DNA and identity of Souls over traditional hack and slash. And I can't think of a franchise that exemplifies this more than Darksiders. Before I really dive into these games, I think it's important for me to go over what I think makes a good hack and slash. Everyone has different reasons for liking this genre, so what are mine? Firstly, I think one of the most important aspects is making sure the player is given enough tools. Not necessarily just weapons, though weapons is the usual toolkit for this genre. But having a decent range of tools in your kit will allow better players or more observant players to interact with the kit and enemies themselves on a higher level. Which is my next point, interactivity. Something I hate about modern action games is the inclusion of things like stagger bars. In my opinion, they completely ruin any sort of interactivity with a game's combat system and enemies. A good example of this is Final Fantasy XVI. Yeah, you can juggle enemies like goblins and other similar sized enemies, but anything bigger than Clive, hunts, and bosses all have stagger bars. The issue with this is that, at least in 16 specifically, you have made your selection of abilities, your loadout, whatever. You then go to engage with a larger enemy, you very quickly realise that you have zero control over the enemy and the combat in general. The enemies don't react to your hits, so there's no hit stun. It's not about finding openings and punishing the enemy with your full kit, which is what the other side of this coin is. The interactivity this genre gives you is, or should be, pretty expansive. Two very good examples of this is Angelo Credo from Devil May Cry 4 and Virgil from Devil May Cry 5. Angelo Credo is a great boss fight because everything he does, Nero has a hard counter. The spear throw he does, if you time it right, Nero can grab it with his Devil Bringer and throw it back for a free combo. A lot of players will simply just dodge the attacks, which is fine, but the game lets you experiment with your character's kit and the enemy attacks. I'm not going to go over the full ins and outs of Credo's boss fight. I will link to a 15-year-old video in the description detailing every move he has and how Nero can counter it. The same can be said for Virgil in Devil May Cry 5. If you just walk up to him and attack, he's going to parry and punish you hard. This is the interactivity I expect from the hack and slash genre, making players use their character's kit in fun and experimental ways. Finally, player input. I think this could be lumped in with the interactivity point, but I'm talking about what your specific buttons do. One of my favourite things from Darksiders, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, etc. is pulling the left stick back, pressing a button, and it launching an enemy into the air. Then another button or directional input to put your character into the air to do an air combo. It's usually just a jump, but some games have better ways to get into the air. This basic form of complexity is missing from the modern action game. I'm not saying that every single button, direction, etc. needs to have a brand new hyper-specific use, but at a certain point, action games being dumbed down like this feels somewhat offensive. It feels like an attack on my intelligence, and worst of all, my curiosity of the game that has been crafted for me, the player. Of the 3 points I've listed here, I think this one is the most important to me. I love pressing buttons, and when a game's buttons feel good, they let you actually control what's on your screen, the game feels elevated because of it. In terms of hack and slash games, Darksiders is probably one of the more famous games, not as a whole, but for its ending specifically. You see, chronologically, the game is the latest. People have been waiting for a true follow-up for 15 years. All of the sequels lead into this ending, so in a weird sense, they are just prequels, despite being called 2 and 3. But the story isn't the focus of this video. The focus is on the gameplay and how Darksiders showcases the timeline of hack and slash games being phased out.
You will be hunted. The White City for certain. The Council, and there will be others. You would wage this war alone?
No. Not alone.
Darksiders 1 is pretty traditional in its combat, especially in comparison to its genre predecessors. If you've played games like Devil May Cry 3 or God of War, a lot of the knowledge you have from those games' combat systems can be applied here pretty easily. So, what are the basics of Darksiders combat? Over the course of the game, you get 3 total weapons and a bunch of tools. The 3 weapons are Chaos Eater, Scythe, and Tremor Gauntlets. These are the main weapons with the moveset you will use the most. Chaos Eater is your main driver for attacks. This weapon gets the most moves of the 3 weapons available to you. This weapon is the bread of the combat system. Pretty limited as to what you can do with it on its own, but the Scythe and Tremor Gauntlets, that's the butter, the peanut butter, jam, Nutella, whatever you put on your bread. The point is, the Scythe and Tremor Gauntlets are the filler you use in between attacks with Chaos Eater. The Scythe is very AoE focused, as you would expect. It synergizes really well with Chaos Eater. On the ground, it has wide sweeping attacks, and if you hold the button, you can do a big 360 degrees AoE attack. Great for groups. Unfortunately for the Tremor Gauntlets, I couldn't really figure them out in a combo setting, and that's my fault, not the game. They always felt more like a big, heavy combo finisher than anything that keeps the combo going. And again, that's my fault because I didn't really get curious enough to learn how the gauntlets can be used in combat. And I know for a fact all 3 of these weapons can be used effectively in combos because I've seen them used in combo videos and combo mads, which I will be posting a bunch of these in the description because these people are much better than me at the game and can showcase the combat of these games at a level that I simply cannot. Now, this is something I really enjoy about Darksiders and think more hack and slash games should lean towards. And that's the tools of the game. These are intended to be used for puzzles, exploration, and getting around the levels in general. However, these also have uses in combat. These tools include the crossblade. a large shuriken range type weapon. This is used to activate various objects scattered around the environment. There's crystals that sometimes need to be hit in one go, so you'll mark them all with the crossblades and let it rip to hit them all. You use the crossblades to blow up throwable bombs you find scattered around that you throw at Gross to progress through different levels. There's the Earth Caller. This is a horn that you use to wake up various wardens throughout the game that are blocking your progress. And finally, the Abyssal Chain is a grappling hook that you use to get around the environment. What these items all share in common is that they have environmental uses, but also can be used in combat. The crossblade can be charged up and thrown at enemies. It will stick to them for a duration and deal damage over time before returning to war. However, my favourite use for the crossblades is resetting your attacks in the air. I'll try to find an example for background footage, but if you get an enemy into the air and you start attacking while you yourself are in the air, you will eventually run out of attacks. War does a downward strike to force the enemy down with him. However, if you tap R2, which is the button to use the crossblade, just before the downward strike, it will reset all of War's attacks as if he hadn't done any attacks in the air at all. And this goes back to what I was saying with interactivity. Whether this is an intended effect of the crossblades or not is irrelevant. The mechanic exists, and the game is better and deeper because of it. I could have gone the entire game without discovering this, but my curiosity of the game's systems pushed me to experiment, and I was rewarded for it. The same with the Earth Caller and the Abyssal Chain. Earth Caller knocks enemies away, Abyssal Chain brings them towards you. I was never curious about these tools. I used them a couple of times in combat. I didn't really vibe with what they were doing for me, so I didn't experiment with them. I think this is something that's also really important with hack and slash as a genre, and that's that the combat should always be open-ended. The developers should never tell the player how things interact. Just, I guess, code in some basic interactions, then let the players discover the limits for themselves. There are other things that you can use, like Mercy, which is Strife's handgun. I used this for a little bit, and I just preferred the crossblade for a ranged weapon. I'm sure that if I extensively used it, I would have found some intricacies with it, just like I did with the crossblade. War also has active abilities that he can use. These use a resource called Wrath. I personally did not use these. The main reason for that is that they cost souls to buy and upgrade, which is the game's currency. But then at the same time, it never really felt like the game pushed me to using them. Weapon moves were far more enticing and honestly, way more useful. Let's take the Affliction ability. It shoots out a projectile, and any enemy it hits is afflicted with a damage over time. You would think that in some capacity, the projectile could be used to juggle or have some other quirks to have some more interesting combo potential. But that's not really the case. Affliction specifically does so much damage that I went into my 100% save, so fully upgraded weapons, max level Wrath abilities, etc. And when I used Affliction on any enemy, it did not get a chance to tick any of the damage over time because of the initial hit, instantly killed the enemies. And I think this is where my criticisms of the game's combat start. You just do too much damage to justify any real experimentation with this combat. Each of your 3 main weapons level up the more you hit enemies. This unlocks more moves to buy at the Volgrim shop, but this also increases the damage of your weapon. So it becomes this double-edged sword, really. You want to do more cool combos? Then you need to level up your weapons. However, this makes enemies die faster, which ultimately, it's fine, because as you play the game, you realize the combos aren't the focus. They are just a bonus. After all, Darksiders 1 is more in line with Zelda. The focus is on the dungeons, the exploration, the puzzles, and probably the most apt comparison is the boss fights. As I mentioned earlier, I believe a great hack and slash boss is something that pushes you to learn and experiment, not just with your own moveset, but also bosses. Unfortunately, That's not the case here. The bosses are very much in line with Zelda or Mario, where you need to expose a weak point a certain amount of times. This isn't me saying that these boss fights are bad, they're very enjoyable, and I had a lot of fun learning them on the hardest difficulty. But I think this is the true tell that the combat wasn't the main focus, because the boss fights don't complement it the way that other hack and slash games do. Darksiders 1 released almost 2 years before Dark Souls 1, so quite a while before the Souls-like craze infected the industry. However, it did release 1 month before Dante's Inferno and 2 months before God of War 3, which is a crazy run. Looking back, this was somewhat of a swan song. I'm pretty sure that's the wrong word, but the point still stands. Hack and slash games became few and far between, and as time went on, the gap got bigger and bigger. The genre became more obscure. Darksiders 1 was a great first entry to a brand new hack and slash series. However, there is still 2 more games to go that released in various stages of the Souls-like infection. So next up, Darksiders 2.
To bargain for war's freedom, Death swore that he would resurrect humanity. But he knew not how this might be done. And so Death rode forth into the icy veil to find the Keeper of Secrets.
Darksiders 2 released in August of 2012, just under 2 years after the first game, but still somewhat before the Souls-like infection really took over. That's not to say that there wasn't another infection present though. Darksiders 2 unfortunately had the loot-based RPG infection. Don't get me wrong, I love a loot-based RPG. Path of Exile is one of my all-time favourite games, but it's all about context. In this case, the context of the first game. Darksiders 1 was a very precisely made Zelda-like. Everything was very much set in stone. You got your tools and weapons at a set pace throughout the dungeons. When you found and opened chests, you were likely to get some form of an upgrade. Lifestone shards, wrath shards, passives from the bigger chests, abyssal armor pieces. This all allowed for the developers to have a greater level of cohesion in its mechanics and combat. Everything about it is very much like a puzzle. So what did they do with this design philosophy in Darksiders 2? They got rid of it. All of it. The design philosophy of 1 is not expanded upon, which I believe sequels should always do. Instead, they decided to strip the foundation down to nothing and restart. Before I get into this, I'm going to be very blunt. I did not like this game in the slightest. I thought this game was pretty miserable to play. When you start playing Darksiders 2, it does feel familiar, but when you start diving deeper into the mechanics, it all starts to fall apart, and it only gets worse the more you play. In terms of weapons, this is probably the biggest offender of the game, and that's because, as I said, the game is a loot-based RPG now. Your scythes don't really change moveset, that's fine. The issue comes from your secondary slot. What you have here is entirely dependent on RNG. You get 2 options. A heavy, slow weapon, typically a hammer, axe, or a glaive. Something along those lines. Or a light, fast weapon. These are always fist weapons, but with different flavours. Now, here's the problem. It does not matter which variant of each weapon you have. The overall moveset stays the same. The only thing that changes is what happens when you hold the button, which is triangle or Y depending on which controller you are using. I use these so little that by towards the end of the game, I had completely forgotten that they even existed. And because of this constant swapping of weapons, well, the developer intent of you constantly swapping weapons, the developers had to design the combat around that, meaning there's very little cohesion between the player and the combat system. A big thing Darksiders 1 does very well is the tools. They have environmental use and combat use. Well, they're gone in Darksiders 2. The tools you do get are exclusively for traversal and puzzles. The only one that has a combat use is Death Grip. And the deeper you get into the game, the more you realize just how required this is to fight enemies. That's because eventually every enemy has super armor, meaning no matter what you do, the enemy will not react to your hit and be completely unfazed. This becomes really clear when you get into a situation where you're fighting 4 or 5 of these enemies at once. They will stun lock you over and over. When they attack, they will home in on you. This also means they will hit you mid-dodge, because for some ungodly reason, you do not have iframes while dodging. So trying to manage these super armor enemies and gripping them one by one to actually knock them down to juggle them feels terrible. I had multiple points throughout my playthrough where I wanted to just quit because of this. I wasn't being rewarded for dodging and punishing attacks. I wasn't rewarded for exploring my curiosity of the game's mechanics. And this is a big departure from Darksiders 1, because yes, that game has super armor enemies too. The key difference is your defensive options. I'm not going to chime in on the parry debate that action games fans have, but ultimately I like parry as a mechanic. And that is your defensive option in Darksiders 1. This gives you so much control over all of the enemies in the game. And again, this leads back to the curiosity aspect of action games. With a parry, you get curious to find out which attacks can or can't be parried, and what your options are after the parry or instead of parrying. So what does Darksiders 2 do? Well, obviously, it removes parry as an option. So your only defense is dodging, which just like Darksiders 1, it's 2 true dodges, then the third one is a longer dodge with a recovery. This sucks because multiple bosses have you dodge 2 attacks, then you can't properly follow up and punish because a third dodge forces you into a long recovery. So I guess the intention is for you to walk to the boss? It's such a strange way to design your combat system. And I know that there is technically a parry in Darksiders 2, but it is so much worse that it's not ever worth using. In Darksiders 1, you stand still and press a button. That is how you parry. It feels very good and responsive. In Darksiders 2, your quote-unquote parry is exclusive to the buckler fist weapon base, and it's not even really a parry. It's more like a block with damage reduction. You still take damage through the block, just reduced. And the timing sucks and kind of makes it a worthless mechanic. Again, in Darksiders 1, you press a button as the attack connects. For Darksiders 2, you need to hold the attack button, so triangle or Y, for a solid second before the block animation even starts. This is a good time to talk about death in general. In a vacuum, I don't think he controls or plays bad, but the game does not accommodate what death needs to thrive. All of his attacks are animation locked. At least that's how it feels anyway. If there is a way to cancel animations, I never found it. So this means that when you're fighting these enemies with super armor, they will attack you during your own attack animations, and there's nothing you can really do against it. When you're 1v1 with these enemies, it generally feels okay. However, in groups, it completely falls apart. A big part of this feeling is the levels and stats. stats. The combat revolves around having a build and not so much learning move sets. Remember when I mentioned in the Darksiders 1 section about how you eventually get too strong and deal too much damage? I'm going to say that this issue is significantly worse in Darksiders 2 because now it's a balance. In Darksiders 1, just stop fighting every enemy you see. You won't get overpowered as fast. Now, in Darksiders 2, the issue has been inflated significantly. It's not just a problem of potentially being overpowered, but also now underpowered. I found very few moments during my playthrough to actually experiment with Death's kit. Things either die too fast or not fast enough, and then you get overwhelmed. This is really evident within boss fights. If you're not on level or close, you just do chip damage. Very quickly, off topic for a second, this isn't really about combat and I apologize for that, but the world design is baffling. You'll go through a brand new area or a dungeon for the first time and find a side boss, like the ones Thane tasks you to kill. But you always find these bosses way too early, so they're just damage sponges. It's so baffling to design your game like this. Let's take Argul, for example. When you get to the area where his dungeon is, it is directly in your cone of vision, and it is bigger than the door to the main quest area. That is going to catch anyone's eye, and there is a side quest to go there. You go through the dungeon, fighting the enemies with little to no trouble, but then you get to the boss. And this is in the context of trying this boss when you discover this dungeon in the Kingdom of the Dead. It's a damage sponge. Now, it's not impossible, but you'll be there for upwards of 10 or 15 minutes just hitting it over and over and over again, doing chip damage. And this is the greater problem of Darksiders 2. They gutted the entire foundation to make a worse product. Death is clunky and slow because of the animation lock. The levels and stats are obtrusive, which, by the way, just remembered as I'm writing this, remember those executions in Darksiders 1? You get an enemy down to a certain HP threshold, press a button to get a kill animation? Well, once again, obviously, that's gone. That is now a stat. It is now a chance for that to proc. Genuinely, just baffling design choices. Nothing in this game really pushes you to experiment. It's just, okay, I need to do as much damage as possible before I get overwhelmed and die. There's no curiosity to be had with the game's combat system because everything feels worse. Wrath abilities make a return. Once again, very indifferent on these. Whatever I said during the Darksiders 1 segment more than likely applies here too. And finally, the main story bosses. These are somewhat weird. Most of them are absolutely terrible. In Darksiders 1, most of the bosses, at least the Chosen, are very much just Zelda bosses. Expose a weak point 3 times, hit it 3 times. In Darksiders 2, it's once again gone. Some bosses are vaguely like this, like the Guardian, for example. But for the most part, the boss fights are very Souls-like adjacent. Big monsters, wait for certain attack that makes the boss vulnerable for 5 or 6 seconds, rinse, repeat. And honestly, that design just doesn't fit with hack and slash design philosophy. I would say that there was only 2 boss fights I had fun with, and that was Archon and Samael. I have no idea what the devs were smoking with these boss fights. They were both insanely fun, and they don't really fit in with the rest of the game, at least in my opinion. But again, with how Death's kit is, or lack of a kit, you could say, the boss fights just don't really flow very well. So much of the flow from Darksiders 1 has been completely gutted in favor of chasing RPG systems. Imagine if Devil May Cry 6 got announced, and you had gear, levels, a skill tree. Think about what that would change mechanically and balance-wise. When you have an established identity, having this drastic of a change is going to bring benefits for sure. But at the same time, you're going to lose the core audience of the first game. They chased the popular games of the time instead of evolving what they already had.
Dreams more thrilling than reality. Had I known the new pact would be so exciting, I would have let walls separate my head from my neck then and there. Is it possible to die of boredom? Rampage. Bored as I am, perhaps you're just lazy. If I didn't love you so much, I'd kill you just for something to do. The call? Finally.
Before I really dig into Darksiders 3, I need to say that after Darksiders 2, Vigil Games, the original studio, shut down due to THQ folding. So yes, while Darksiders 3 is by a different studio, the commonality here is that all three games share the same director, David Adams. I've done some research, and as of 2015, I know, very old information, but still only 3 years before Darksiders 3 released, Gunfire Games had 22 employees, and 20 of them were from Vigil Games. Wikipedia says that between that number in 2015 and November 2017, Gunfire Games gained 38 employees, jumping up to 60 total. For this 60 number, I can't find a split on how many of those 60 were original Vigil Games developers. And I have no idea how many developers they're up to now. This seems like useless information to bring up, and I kind of agree. It's just that sometimes when a game series changes studios, changes the people putting in the work, the conversation usually defaults to, well, the game sucks because the new people don't understand what made the series good. And I just can't really agree with that. For sure, there are cases where the new developers don't really understand the originals, but in my opinion, that's rare. Most of the time, it's the publisher wanting a new game out in that series, not really caring about it in any capacity, and just giving the license to anyone willing. I'm not accusing anyone of doing this. I just want to get in early and make sure this sentiment isn't expressed in my comment section. Darksiders 3 is so far the biggest departure of what Darksiders 1 was. This game is a Souls-like, borrowing many design philosophies from them. I think Fury is the biggest victim of this infection though. Where Darksiders 2 stripped away the foundations and sort of rebuilt it with paper mache, Darksiders 3 was stripped back and didn't really build anything to replace that structure. Fury has no combos. She has no tech for players to find or experiment with, and this is all just to facilitate Souls-like design. And yes, I do know about default and classic game mode. I will talk about classic afterwards. I believe that in situations like this, your first playthrough should always be the original game mode. Something that really kind of bothered me with this combat system was that Fury's moveset doesn't really ever change. You start with the game with her basic weapon, a whip. But here's the problem. If you look at the move list right at the very beginning of the game, then again, right before the final boss, it's the exact same. For the whip or any other weapon, the moveset never changes. There are no purchasable moves like in 1 and 2. So the question then becomes, does the combat open up as you get more weapons? And the answer is no. After defeating specific bosses, you'll gain access to a new hollow form, which brings along with it a new secondary weapon. These weapons don't really do anything to the overall flow of combat, because just as in Darksiders 2, you are once again animation locked, though it does feel much better here because the game feels designed for this. The only thing you can really do is attack with the whip once, then press the secondary weapon button to do a follow-up attack. But that's pretty much where the interaction ends. You can do this vice versa too, but the issue is that's the limit. You start to brainstorm potential interactions, and the game just trips you up and shoots you in the head no mercy. By the way, while we're on the topic of move list, Fury has no direct launcher. What I mean by that is getting an enemy into the air. To do this, your options are perfect dodging forward into an attack and pressing either weapon button. The other option is whip attack, delay, whip attack, whip attack. So 3 button presses. Neither of these really feel all that good, especially since Fury has no follow-up. If you dodge launch with the whip, Fury will go up with the enemy, but it's kind of predetermined what you're going to do, because once again, you are animation locked. In Darksiders 1, for example, if you do the launcher with the scythe, you can cancel the animation with a jump to follow the enemy and do an air combo. And as I've said, Darksiders 1 has tech like the crossblade to keep the air combo going past the intended endpoint. 3 just doesn't have anything like that. The crossblade returns, but it's so slow and kind of clunky to use in combat that you end up only using it in puzzles or for specifically the fly enemies and their nests around the world. And that's kind of it for tools. With each game, the player gets less and less tools, and it kind of sucks. I guess in a way, the hollow forms give you tools, but they're exclusively for world traversal. For example, the fire hollow gives Fury a 3rd jump. How I would have designed this in a proper hack and slash setting would be something as simple as let the player animation cancel the jump. The jump does damage, so let the enemy sort of get sucked into it, then just let the player attack at any time. It's the same with the Force Hollow. This lets you turn into a large purple rock to stick to specific surfaces scattered around the game world. Turn this into a parry. If you time the rock perfectly, make it parry the enemy and open the enemy up for a combo. It's little things like this that Darksiders 3 misses. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is a classic mode that was added post-launch. This is intended to simulate the combat and flow of the first 2 games, and I will be honest, it does feel much better. For example, you remember one of those launcher options I mentioned earlier, the 3 button one with a delay? Well, on default, if you'd done this, you had to commit to the full string. On classic, after knocking the enemy up, you can do the input for the forward saw attack, which, fantastic. But that's kind of the extent of it. What classic mode does is it allows you to cancel specific animations you couldn't before, but not every single animation. But to truly emulate the feel of 1 and 2, unfortunately you would need to essentially remake the entire game and combat from the ground up. At its core, its soul, it is still fundamentally a Souls-like. I compared classic and default for a little bit before writing all of this. One thing I was curious about, for example, was form switching, because you have to be in that specific form to use that secondary weapon. And on both modes, it's pretty restrictive on when you can actually form switch. You can't do it while attacking, for example, which makes sense because of how the combat is currently designed. On playthrough 2, which was my classic mode playthrough, I discovered that if you perfect dodged and then went into another form, it would do that form's counterattack. I went back to default to see if that was a classic mode only thing, but no, it works that way on default too. I found that a lot of intricacies I found on classic mode already existed on default. I'm really appreciative of classic mode being added to this game because it really showcases how different and incompatible Souls-likes and hack and slash really is. They are 2 completely separate genres. I have no idea why studios ever tried combining them or replacing hack and slash with them. I don't hate Darksiders 3 or Souls-likes. I very much enjoyed Darksiders 3, way more than Darksiders 2, and I enjoy Souls-likes in general. I'm just kind of at a point where I want action games to go back to the 2000s and very early 2010s with action design. I'm tired of stagger bars. I'm tired of enemies not having any form of hit stun. I'm tired of stamina bars, which I'm going to praise Gunfire Games here. Thank you, Gunfire Games, for not falling for the stamina bar trap. But I'm not going to sit here and just completely shit on Darksiders 3. It came out in 2018. Souls-likes were the rage back then. But in general, this kind of showcases how trends infect the industry. Darksiders 1 was inspired by Zelda, Darksiders 2 became a loot-based RPG, then Darksiders 3 a Souls-like. I really wish I had more to say about Darksiders 3, but unfortunately there's just no expression to the game. I'm not someone who believes that every action game should be DMC. DMC is its own thing, and I don't think other games should attempt to replicate that. The thing I truly love about this genre is the sandbox feel to the combat. You get weapons, you get tools, maybe you get abilities like in Darksiders. And then the developers just let the players mess around with it all to discover the limit of what they've made. In something like DMC, every tool you get is intended for combat, which again, good for DMC, but other games shouldn't be designed like that. It really sucks that Souls-likes have kind of replaced hack and slash games. Ironically, they feel soulless in some capacity, just trend chasing and not really trying to innovate in any way. From Software is not the arbiter of video games. They haven't solved mechanics, combat design, or whatever. And that's not really just a From Software thing. No developer has solved game mechanics. There will always be room to innovate. It is silly to think otherwise. Don't get me wrong, I love From Software. I love Elden Ring. I love Sekiro. But these games are not perfect in any way, shape, or form. Just because they are beloved does not mean they have to be copied one to one. You can iterate on top of all of this. One of the reasons I made this video was my disdain for how common Souls-likes have become. The other reason was that Darksiders 4 was announced. Right now, we don't have any gameplay, but I'm cautiously excited for Darksiders 4 because it's once again developed by Gunfire Games. I think in general, I have a bit more hope than despair, but the reality is that Gunfire have only made Souls-likes or VR games. But I'm not going to doom and gloom about it. Adding the classic mode to Darksiders 3 shows me, at least a little bit, that Gunfire understands what Darksiders gameplay should be and what it needs. In general, the future of this genre is somewhat bright. It can be brighter for sure, but I think the general public is starting to turn against Souls-likes. If the industry has just a handful more successful hack and slashes, I think the tide will start to turn somewhat. In an ocean of Souls-likes, Remedy just announced Control Resonant at the Game Awards. I won't lie to you, when I saw that scene in the trailer of the guy in the subway with the dual swords, I thought it was going to be a Souls-like. I have never been happier to be wrong. I think Remedy is a great studio to go into the hack and slash genre. Remedy is all about spectacle, letting the player do what they want. The problem with Souls-likes is that the spectacle typically comes from the bosses. The player is just a small piece of that, often feeling like you don't have control over anything. Once again, I think the future of this genre is bright. I'm not asking for Souls-likes to disappear, but maybe developers should start considering how oversaturated the games industry is with Souls-likes, and maybe start looking at other options within melee action games. Remember, balance is good, but right now, the scale is tipped towards Souls-likes too heavily.